Okay, chapter 23, part 2. If you remember, we were saying that with chapter 23, we've entered a new time period, 1750 through, at least as far as Europe is concerned, through the beginning of World War One. Very pivotal event in world history, so that's kind of where we're stopping it. We said with part 1 that we had was known as an age of revolutions. We had a population revolution, we had an American revolution, we had a French revolution, we had an industrial revolution, we had impacts of the industrial revolution, those kind of things. All right. So what else about the impact of this time period in the Industrial Revolution? One of the things that occurs during this time period that maybe is not considered a revolution exactly, but we do see two new nations are created in Europe. And really, this is very important because the 1800s, the 19th century, was definitely a rise in what we call nationalism, the nation state. This idea that all people who share a common culture, common idea, like all Italians who speak Italian, have Italian heritage, all live under one government. All Germans live under one government. Well, that had already happened before this time period in Spain, Portugal, England, France, Holland. And so they had gone exploring. The ones who hadn't were Germany and Italy. So let's talk about those two real quickly. First of all, we've got the guy who's kind of given credit for it is Count Cavour. He's from the Piedmont region of Italy, northern Italy. He helps unite Italy. But the story's a little more complicated than just that. What has happened is because Italy, going all the way back to the Renaissance, was wealthy. Remember, Italy was wealthy. That's why the Renaissance started there. That they've been very, very wealthy. And because they were divided up into little principalities, their own little states, they are kind of weak. And when France and Spain get their act together, they'll actually get involved in Italian politics. Austria to the north will get involved in Italian politics. Remember that Austrian involvement because that's going to play a role during World War One. But anyway, they've been involved in Italian politics and Italy's been divided up. So in the 1800s, Italy finally decides that it's going to try to unite. Cavour deals with northern Italy, which is more urban, more industrialized, and wealthier. The southern area is more agricultural and less developed. Now, Cavour unites northern Italy, but we need to give credit to another guy called Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi had what were called the red shirts because, yeah, that's right, they wore red shirts. So Garibaldi unites southern Italy. And there actually was thinking right before he united with northern Italy that he might just decide he liked his own country and keep southern Italy to himself. He does not. He joins with northern Italy, and we get full-fledged Italy in 1861. Otto von Bismarck is leader of, and this is what's on your map there, the largest German-speaking state in Europe at the time. And that's Prussia. People are known as Prussians. But Germans have never been able to completely unite. Partially goes back to the Protestant Reformation. See, most Germans are, at least in northern Germany, are Protestant or some version of Lutheranism, but heavy Protestant. In the southern German states, there are a lot of German-speaking states. There are a lot of Catholics, and they don't want to unite with the Protestants because they're afraid the Protestants will mistreat them. So what do? Well, Otto von Bismarck felt like maybe if all German speakers hated one group, we could all ally together and our hatred of that group would override our differences. And he was right. And that group he picked a fight with? The French. Okay. And so he says, we've got to deal with the French. We as Germans need to protect ourselves against the French, and the best way to protect ourselves is to unite. And so in 1871, Germany will unite. Otto von Bismarck followed a philosophy, and I've got it there, called Realpolitik. Realpolitik simply means basically realistic politics for your nation. You do what you have to. You say, wait a minute, that sounds familiar to me. Didn't Mr. Keller talk about that last year on Machiavelli? You do what it takes to keep and retain power. That's right, he did. But Machiavelli was talking about one guy, a king. What did a king do in order to get and keep power? So Realpolitik dealt with what do you as a nation do to keep yourself powerful and to keep yourself in control. And he believed, much like Machiavelli, you don't worry about the consequences, or you don't worry about what's morally right. You just worry about doing what works. So you keep your nation powerful. Another revolution, another one of our revolutions is some major social movements come along. First one is socialism. Karl Marx argued that essentially history is driven by who controls the means of production. In other words, the people in charge are those who control what makes you wealthy. So during the Middle Ages in Europe, what made one wealthy was control of land. Because if you owned land, you had serfs, you had food, you had what you needed. And he argues that we need, we should, that they are the people in control. And then he says during the commercial revolution, it's merchants because they're the ones taking it from the small home manufacturing, the cottage industry, and selling it. So they're getting wealthy. And he said now under industrialization and capitalism, it's workers, proletariat, he called them, the proletariat working for the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were the wealthy, those who own the means of production, factories, and those kind of things. He believed that throughout history, the people at the bottom had kind of pushed and gotten rid of the people at the top, and now the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie and replace them. He said that you guys know the term bourgeoisie. You've all heard it. You've heard bougie, meaning somebody who's got wealth and that kind of stuff. It just comes from the term bourgeoisie. Socialist parties grew in popularity across Western Europe. We don't often think about that, but they really did gain a lot of popularity, and particularly in Germany. And that's going to play, you'll please remember that, because that's going to play a role in some future things that Germany does during World War I. Marx believed that the proletariat would rise up, overthrow the rich, and we'd have a revolution, and we would share. We'd be you would get what you needed and how hard you worked. And he's revolutionary. He thinks this is going to be an uprising. Where he was wrong is he did not think that governments would adapt to the new economic stresses. In other words, he thought the rich were driven by the profit motive, and they would do whatever it took to keep wages low and profits high. Eventually, that pressure of wages low and profits high would lead to a revolution. And he thought because they held the profits and held the money, they also told the government what to do. And there was some truth in that. What he did not think would happen is that governments would eventually make allowances for the working class and give them an opportunity to raise themselves up. And he thought that the governments would never side. So when he proposed things that to us sound like pretty normal stuff, no child labor, you can't work somebody under age of 16, 40-hour work week, you should have a couple of days off. If you got to work more than 40 hours a week, you should have overtime. You should have protection for workers, things that we kind of take for granted that when he wrote that in 1848, didn't look like any government was going to give into, but they do. So he was wrong there. The other big reaction to industrialization and was feminist movements. They asked for equal access to employment, voting, and political power. Now, it's going to take them a while to get there. It's going to take almost 100 years, but they will eventually get the right to vote and own property. In some places, they still couldn't own property in the 1800s. And those kind of things are going to come. Middle class women are leading that charge, particularly educated women. And a very ironic thing, the 1800s, the feeling was we need to expand education. So as we expand education, we need more teachers. Because people who work with children should be women. The women will be the teachers. And because we need our teachers to be educated and teachers need to be women, we're going to educate some women. But as they educate women, these women become the very ones who will push back against the system and push for change in feminist movements. Okay, another big thing is as we reduce the work week, as workers get better wages, one of the things they've got is they've got leisure time. So what are some things they jump into in leisure time? Well, one of the things is team sports. People love, and they still do. They like team sports because of discipline and coordination. And remember, again, you do not have to write everything down. Commercial industry grew up around these things: uniforms, rubber balls, stadiums. Today, it's talk radio, stuff online, television stations. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Dodgeball. It might be, maybe it's getting too old. I don't know. But in Dodgeball, they make fun of, they've got ESPN Ocho, ESPN 8, and which shows things like Dodgeball. And if you think about it, there are a ton of sports stations, hyper community loyalties. People maybe, well, I need to change that now. They're no longer the Redskins, are they? The Washington football team. Hyper loyalty to your local community. I often ask, can anybody think of a region of the country where people who are there are hyper loyal to their teams? And the two that people always seem to mention are Pittsburgh and New England. People from the Boston area love their Red Sox, love their Patriots. From the Pittsburgh area, they love their Steelers, they love their Penguins. And Olympics are reintroduced in 1896. Also, we see changes in science during this time period. Science really, up until around 1900, has been something that it was felt that any educated person needed to know the basics of science. And I think we still believe that. And they felt pretty comfortable felt like they understood most of science. But science really starts to specialize during this time period. And it's hard for people to know everything about science. One of those famous guys is a guy by the name of Charles Darwin. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. It came out in 1859, and it said that basically plants, animals adjust to their environment and will make changes over time. And those that can make the best adaptations to their environment will survive. Those who do not make the best adaptations will decline or disappear. So what he's not saying, he did not say the survival of the fittest. What he did say is survival of those best suited for their environment. Therefore, dung beetles they poop on the savanna, elephant poop. You would not consider them smart animals, not consider them particularly strong, but they're well adapted to living in that environment, and they do. And then along comes Albert Einstein, and he gives us the theory of relativity, adds notions of time, the idea that time speeds up, time slows down. He takes science to a much more complicated level. Okay? In reaction, because, go back to Newton's laws of physics, every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, one of the reactions to this new science, this new industry, is the Romantic movement in art. And what Romanticism said is we should base art off emotion, our impression. We should try to capture the moment rather than use reason or generalization. We should try to capture the emotion of the moment. So a lot of Renaissance poets made the claim that their poems kind of appeared to them like visions, just came out of the blue. They were in the emotional moment and they wrote it out. And that was what we read. We now know that they much proofread, reworked their poems or their stories to get them what they thought were perfect, even though they claimed it came in a moment of passion. The struggle for me has kind of always been represented by Hawthorne's story, Rappaccini's Daughter. You may have had to read it. I don't know. Essentially, Rappaccini is his scientist, and he says he's got a daughter he thinks is perfect. She's smart. She's kind. She's beautiful, except she's got a birthmark on her face. And he can't seem to get rid of the birthmark. Finally, he figures out how to get rid of the birthmark. And when he gets rid of the birthmark, his daughter dies. Because he tries to use science to make everything perfect. And in doing so, he actually destroys it. That's kind of what these romantic authors believe about science. There are some Western settler societies grew up during this time. Places like Australia, New Zealand, Western United States. Why? They need new markets for their processed goods. They want commercial agriculture in other regions. In other words, England's population has grown to the point they can't grow enough food to feed their whole population. So you need to import food from these places and hopefully get some cash crops. Ease of communication and transportation facilitated expansion. What I mean is it was easier to expand because we could travel easier. What were some of the things that made travel easier? That's right, railroads, steam engines, steamships all make it easier to get from one place to another, get food from one place to another before it spoils. Also, there are nationalist rivalries. Everybody wants to be the country with the most colonies. That's why as soon as Germany unites in 1871, they set off after Africa to try to grab some colonies, hoping there are still some potentially available to them. Actually, England will kind of finish this time period with the greatest number of colonies. Business people who have a lot of money are always looking for new ventures, new places to put their capital, that is their money. They're looking for new places to invest in. So they're excited about this. And it actually leads to a massive European immigration. Obviously, to Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, European descendants, the western part of the United States. Okay, because we get a lot of European immigrants. Canada, parts of South America, Argentina. Okay, and one of the things that I want to mention just as a kind of a general trend here is we've got an emerging power of the United States. For the first 100 years, the United States remains relatively isolated. But the Civil War in the United States, 1861 through 1865, which brings an industrial North versus an agricultural slaveholding South, will actually accelerate America's industrialization. We're already moving that direction, but war really pushes it into high gear. Why? Well, we need rifles, we need weapons, we need clothes. So we step up the internal United States production of those kind of things, particularly in New England, and it really pushes things. A lot of people consider the United States Civil War to be the first modern war, sort of like a total war. And it really becomes that, where even in the past, we considered civilians to be kind of off limits for the most part. That didn't always work that way. Of course, there were horrible things went on, but the idea was the civilians are generally we leave them alone. Well, now we're going to destroy factories, we're going to destroy farms because we want to cut the strength of the armies out from under each other. So, in many ways, this becomes the first real total war. I've already mentioned there are settlements in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So, where these places are pretty far apart. So, what's the connection? All remained relatively agricultural, which necessitated that they make exchanges with England. By that, I mean that made it necessary that they buy products off England. Okay. They did adopt themes of liberalism, which means more voting. Ideas of socialism, modern art, and science were transported to these places. So they behaved much like Europeans. They received new waves of immigrants throughout the 19th century, throughout the 1800s from Europe. This export of people is a huge issue. And industrialization leads to rapid colonization. What that means is because these European countries are industrialized, they've had better weapons now. But now not only do they have better weapons, but they've got lots of them because they can turn them out. So it makes industrialization and takeover, colonization in places like Africa much easier. It's something that they could never have done. Not that they didn't want to colonize Africa, because they did, but they just couldn't before because Europeans were not strong enough. African kingdoms were powerful and they couldn't use horses because the tsetse fly would bring a disease to horses and horses would die. Zebras wouldn't let you ride on their back. So it wasn't until they got steamships and railroads that they were really able to move in. So, and communication, the telegraph, was a big advancement, and that allowed much quicker communication, brought your colonies closer to you. All right, and to finish this time period off, I want to just mention it. I'm really going to hammer this at the beginning of World War I, but we had a new alliance system grow up. What does that mean? Well, to back up, if you remember the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, remember that from chapter 23, part 1, the one you just watched before this one, 23, part 1. What happened was that Napoleon had lost, and in 1815, they tried to create a balance of power in Europe. The Congress of Vienna did. They did that by shrinking down France, so France wasn't too strong. Prussia was pretty strong, but not overwhelmingly strong. But when Prussia unites all the German speakers together, England, France go, ooh, that's a pretty strong nation. Plus, they're industrialized like crazy. They're educated like crazy. So they're immediately seen as a threat to the others. So the others decide to Adam, would you get that? It's right there. Thank you. Just stop it. Sorry, I went too long and one of my alarms went off. Apologize. Let me wrap this up. So Germany has united. It scared France and England half to death. It's upset the balance of power. And the balance of power has worked pretty well in Europe for about 50 years until the 1880s, really. So longer than 50 years, 1815 through 1880s is about 70 years. So it's been pretty successful. So England and France aligned together, and Russia's scared of Germany, so they aligned against Germany with Russia. Germany looks at the alliance of Britain, France, and Russia and says, dang on, I'm trapped. I'm on both sides, so I need friends. So they reach out to Austria-Hungarian Empire and Italy, and they become friends. So it's the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Italy, against the Triple Alliance, which is Britain, France, and Russia. P.S. Something I'm going to talk about when I look at Russia specifically is they go through a revolution in 1905, which really upsets Russia internally. They get beat by Japan. It's embarrassing. That really creates problems inside Russia. All right. Balkans add to the difficulty here. I put a triangle around the Balkan Peninsula. See how it sticks out from the Adriatic and down from the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Balkans have broken away from the Ottoman Empire during this time period. When we talk about the Ottoman Empire, you're going to realize they're getting weaker. Serbia is expanding. Serbia sits right about there. I guess you can't see it. See if I can get the mouse to come on. There it is. There. Serbia's right there. Down inside the Balkan Peninsula. They don't want the Austro-Hungarian Empire to tell them what to do, so the Ottomans have left. The Austrians are trying to come down and take over, and so there's strife there. Princeps kills the Archduke Ferdinand. I'll talk about that a little bit more with World War I, but essentially Ferdinand kind of thumbs his nose, comes to Kosovo, comes to Serbia. The Serbians don't want them there. It's seen as a slap in the face for him to arrive, and they assassinate him while he's there. Austria wants to punish Serbia, and that will lead to World War I. All right, wrapping this bad boy up. In what ways did diplomacy and government policy help to contribute to the buildup for World War I? Okay, a couple things. We're going to talk about this more when we enter World War I, but just prepping you for it. Nationalist competition got out of control. Competition between Germany, Great Britain, France, and Russia to a lesser degree intensifies, and there really steps the pressure up. The governments attempt to distract their populations through foreign actions. They're saying, hey, German workers, we know you're upset about your wages and your working conditions, but right now we got to go grab colonies in Africa. So please cooperate, because if we don't, we're going to get beat by England and France. And you don't want that, right? And they're going, no, don't want that. So yeah, I'll be quiet while we do this. Military buildups. Everybody's competing for colonies and competing with each other. One of the ways they compete is to build up these strong militaries. They're going to actually arrive in 1914, and they're going to have such strong militaries, they're going to say, nobody can beat our military. And they're going to be guys who go, hey, we got all these cool weapons. We ought to use them. Nobody can beat us. Then newspapers shape nationalist pride. They'll call politicians out if they're not tough enough. And we're going to really see that in the United States with what we call yellow journalism, trying to sell papers. And the Spanish-American War in the late 1890s, the Maine will blow up in a Cuban harbor. We will blame it on the Spanish, although historically it does not appear that that's what actually happened. Most historians don't believe. At the time, you couldn't prove it, but they threw headlines across that Spain had sunk the U.S. ship, the Maine, and what were we going to do? Were we going to stand aside and let Spain do that to us, or were we going to stand up and fight? Well, we went to war. Initially, in World War I, people were excited about the war. Some people thought it would even be a nice break. We hadn't had a big war in Europe since the 1870s. It's time for a little fight. Boy, were they wrong, because World War I was not like any other, except maybe the American Civil War, not like any other war. And even then, it just way surpassed what went on in the American Civil War. All right, global connections. 3 global connections from this chapter. Imperialism. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later. Redefinition of world economy, where European interests are everywhere in the world. Russia tries to avoid the situation, warned against parliamentary politics where people can vote and discuss and debate. Didn't want any of that. And European ideas of socialism, liberalism, the right to vote, radicalism were exported to other regions in the world. Socialism went heavy to Argentina. A lot of socialists moved there. Okay. And later, these ideas of right to vote, enlightenment, were used to overthrow the Europeans themselves. Okay. Well, thank you guys. Please remember to write out your notes, take some pictures, and turn those in on Google Classroom. Not Google Classroom, I'm sorry. I'm still thinking like last year, in Canvas. Thank you.